Now that we got our sketch lines, we can finally start adding some guides and combing them around. With our sketch lines templated, we will add the first guide. I'm using shortcuts as explained on the previous video. This helped me in a very quickly workflow and switching between brushes all the time. And if I press the point on the right tab, I can see how many segments my actual guide has, and I can dynamically change them on the resampling segments count. I like to work with higher segments because it enables me to bend around and twist the guide as much as I want to without limiting my resolution. In the end, I can resample to another number that will work better with the generated hairs. But on this combing phase, I like to keep it higher. Now I like to give some curvature to the guides and also some lift from the body. I like to add it manually because it varies from guide to guide, and depending on how you bend your guide, you have a completely different result when you actually generate your hairs. Initially, I'm planting guides on areas that I think are more interesting, and those guides are going to help me guide my way around and visualize the bigger flow on that. So I'm placing them on the main areas, on changes of direction, on especially like key points. After all my key points are created, I can start filling in with more guides and refining those directions. At this point, it's still very rough. It's just to give me an overall idea on how it's going to look like. And I can drop a mirror node and start visualizing the other side. Just remember to reverse normals and turn off consolidate seams. And if you try to do a shortcut for any of the brushes and you get this message, it's because your guide row node is not selected. So it needs to be selected in order to use any of the shortcuts and the brushes. Whenever selected and use the shortcuts, then they will work. So I will keep my node selected and my guides templated. And to have two templates at the same time, you can click on it using Ctrl and Shift. This nose swirl is very specific on this pig. Many animals have swirls on their nose. Some of them have more on the forehead. So that's why it's important to always keep your reference close by and try to follow it as close as possible. And you can change the width at any point to something that works better for you. In this area of the nose, it starts to have a very thin fur that goes against the direction of the main swirl on his nose. And notice how we have a very harsh change of direction on this area. We'll probably need some parting lines that I'm going to explain later on how to use and create them. And start coming close to the eyes. And the eyes are usually very important because whenever you look at an animal or a human, the first thing we see is the eyes. So even if, in this case, the eyes don't have much fur or much information, it's always nice to keep a special care around them. And if you start combing these very small guides near to the surface and they become funky, you can go to your view, pressing D, and then change your near clip plane. In decreasing this value, it will help you combing on these super small guides near the surface. Now we are given the main directions of your flow, and I like to keep this process very artistic and even in a destructive manner. It's like blocking a sculpture. You have to go back and forth many times until you get it right. And if I start adding some like super procedural ways at this stage, it will actually hold me up more than give freedom to my artistic side. I will continue adding more and more guides on those key points. And looking at this nose area, it's quite a thin and non-scraggly fur. And it has a nice change of direction on the very bottom. It's like the hairs go one against the other. And on this very bottom is almost hairless, but even though I like to add some guides, because even if it adds a couple of them, it will add on the correct direction. But you don't need to add as much as you need in other areas. It's just to not leave it empty. and coming on the eye direction, it converges to this area, and on the cheeks it goes downwards. So at this moment I'm not really refining any of these shapes, it's just like roughly blocking out. This whole combing process can take a lot of time to actually have a very nice flow, and I will probably be tweaking it until the very end. Now we are going to start combing his eyebrows, kind of eyebrows, which is those hairs that comes all the way onto the top of his eyes. And there's another functionality about this custom guide groom node that I would like to talk about, that it has an embedded length attribute. This means that we can create a marker to visualize this length attribute on our viewport. So if you click on the visualization on the right tab and create a new marker, you can name it anything you want, like length, and use the length attribute, typing it exactly like that. And then you change it from a marker to a color, and on the color type, from ramped attribute. This enables you to give different colors to different length values. In this case, the blue color means that the shorter hairs are blue, and they go all the way until the red one, and you can add some intermediate colors to help you visualize a little bit better. I like to create kind of like rainbow pattern, so then I have a nice fall off between super short and longer ones. And we can enable and disable toggling the visualizer tab. And the nice thing about it is that it works in real time. So if you actually start extending one guide, all the others are going to get equalized based on that in like real time. This keeps the workflow very consistent. Now we are continuing combing the guides, and at this moment I'm starting filling up them and gaining more and more the shape that I actually want to. And the reason why I like to comb guide by guide instead of like blending all of them at the same time and doing like larger combing brushes on top is because this helps me visualize what is already combed and what is not. And I check from time to time the length as well to make sure I have a nice progression and none of the guides are like sticking out. And this process can be a little bit slower in the beginning, but I realize that after some time that it gives me a more robust shape in the end. It's something that is easier to work on when I start like adding hairs and clumps and noises on top, because this way I know what already have been combed and what not. It's a personal approach. Different people like to work in different ways, and there's no right and wrong. It's only the way that someone is used to, and it's good to experiment different ways to like learn what suits better you. And on different cases, on different animals, in different situations, I might use a different approach. So it's not like a golden rule you have to follow every single time. Just for this case, it's the approach I thought was going to give me a nice flow. This is like sculpting a creature, so we'll go block by block and area by area, adding more and more detail. And I always have to pay attention on the direction the hairs are sticking out of the body, and make sure they are not going to fall on top of the other and intersecting. And now I'm going to show you how to add some parting lines. Parting lines are important to tell how the hairs that's going to be generated with the hair gen are going to be interpolated. Whenever you put a parting line between two guides, this means that the guides on the left side are not going to interpolate with the ones on the right side. It's very important to have some very nice change of direction without needing to actually add a lot of guides. And the way we do this, we use a stroke node, the same as we use it to sketch, set the geometry, and we are going to connect it to a guide partition node. So we connect first our guides, second our skin, and the parting lines on the third input. And make sure it's set to the geometry, and then we can start combing. We are not going to visualize again our sketching lines because we're getting some nice shapes and we don't need it anymore. But we can copy the semi-width technique and use on these parting lines to visualize better. And then we can start blocking where we don't want the hairs to mix the interpolation. Notice that it doesn't have any effect on our guides. The effect is on the actual hairs. This is different from the parting brush that we have on the guide groom. So let's put one to separate the hairs around the eyeline, and this other one on the cheeks, and a bit on the nose. It has some nice changes of direction on this area of the nose. And if we are not happy with the result of this parting line, we can come back and delete it or add more. It's a super flexible workflow. So for now, these ones are just to sketch our main parting lines, but we'll probably change it in the future whenever we start adding the actual hairs on the viewport. And we can continue combing more hairs and filling up a little bit of those gaps and giving more shape and combining with the parting lines. And all of these are going to be merged together in the end. You can see that if you visualize both, then it starts becoming too much. So at this point, I'm giving up the main sketch and only work on what you got so far from the guides. And always like having a look on a reference photo on the right side. Start blocking a little bit more those eyes and separating the area that they actually become less sparse. Normally around the eyes we got a lot of parting happening, and many animals they have very distinct change of directions on this area. I have a few more partings on his forehead. That's very visible. They're not symmetric, but we can break the symmetry later on. We are going to add more and more guides, and notice the change of length between these prongs and the top of the eyes. And this kind of extreme transitions is what makes our creature even more interesting and more realistic. This beak has a nice flow on it. If you look closely, every single animal has a very interesting flow and a very unique one. Even from the same breed and same species, they can vary considerably between each other. So it's always nice to check reference and do not trust your head to imagine how is the actual shape and flow of it. The more you look at references, better your work will be. Always keep one visible on your side. In this case, we're only going to focus on a single reference for a single view, but we normally use many others to work on many angles like side views and body views, and this can become really complex. And try to find references that actually match each other, because this will make our life easier than if you try to match in one angle one thing and on another angle completely different thing. This will drive you mad. And don't forget to add some guides on the tip of the nose, because even if it's a very sparse and thin hairs, it's nice to have them there. And you can use a parting line to actually separate the influence. Parting line can save you some time, so you don't need to keep building guide groups all the time. So they can make your whole workflow a little bit more tidier and clean.